On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, threat of U.S. tariffs on France over a 3% French digital tax. Is the digital levy justified? And alarm over the discovery of microplastic fibers in U.S. rainwater samples. Time to scale back plastic waste? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin today's program with a potential target of U.S. tariffs, France. On Monday, American tech giants voiced support for trade retaliation against France following a new tax imposed on them. Paris says internet companies have not been paying their fair share, while Washington thinks the new law unfairly targets American firms. So what could help ward off a spat over digital tax? Before we ask our panelists from both sides of the argument, take a look at this first.
The French government approving a new digital tax on tech giants.
C'est Amazon, Facebook, Apple et Google, Christophe.
Providing evidence to the so-called 301 investigation, representatives from Amazon, Google, and Facebook, plus several industry associations, testified before the U.S. Trade Representative on Monday about France's new digital tax. Amazon says the 3% tax is harmful and discriminatory. The online retail giant said it will have to raise the fees third-party sellers based in France pay by a corresponding 3%. The USTR will evaluate the comments from U.S. businesses and make a decision about what they may do in response. When French President Emmanuel Macron signed the law last month, President Trump threatened to tax French wine in retaliation.
They should not have done it, so I may do that. I've always liked American wines better than French wines, even though I don't drink wine.
But French officials say this has nothing to do with targeting American companies.
That's not the case. We are not willing to target the American companies. We are just willing to have a fair and efficient taxation of digital activities.
They say companies that sell digital products have been taking advantage of loopholes in an outdated tax system, and it's time to level the playing field. France is not alone in pushing for a digital levy. Britain is set to follow with a similar measure next year. Paris says it aims to fix the issue through multilateral negotiations at the OECD. Later this month at the G7, France will push for a global tax on digital services.
The digital tax spat between France and the U.S. How bad can it get, and what exactly is the nature of this debate? Let's ask our panelists. We are joining Washington, D.C. from the U.S. side, Bruce Fein, a constitutional lawyer and a former Associate Deputy Attorney General, General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Paris, we are joined by Professor Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School in Paris. In London, Dr. Jennifer Pybus, who is a lecturer in digital culture and society at King's College London. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our debate. Go to you first, Mr. Fein. Is the hearing taking place on Monday convincing from some of the tech giants from the U.S.?
I think we need to understand the political dynamics behind this. The tech giants obviously are powerful voices in United States politics. The formula that France has adopted for triggering the tax is aimed to target these international giants. Very small French companies that offer internet services are not taxed at all, which is why I think Macron proposed this, because it doesn't target any of his business constituents. The general argument is that it's discriminatory because the formula that triggers the 3% tax is not even-handed. It requires that the international revenues pass a certain threshold, which, not surprisingly, target these 4 giant companies in the United States. Obviously, these companies have no influence on French politics, so Macron doesn't care about them. But that's the basic issue. I do think that the more complex issue in the digital age is when you have transactions that don't recognize borders. And at present, the digital companies say they can't identify When someone engages in an internet transaction, whether the user is in France, maybe traveling in Switzerland or elsewhere. And so when you're trying to measure the tax based upon the amount of activity in a particular country, there isn't information to do that accurately.
Okay, Professor Yates, you are based in Paris. However, you are from the American graduate school there. So I guess your views could be actually in the middle or probably different. Professor.
Well, you can place me in the middle. That would be fair.
Well, it's up to you as to where you want to stand, not me to place you where you want to stand. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I certainly think that it's time that the very large digital giants who are occupying a larger share of the economy begin to contribute to the public welfare through paying taxation. And these companies often headquarter themselves in low-tax states in Europe, states like Ireland, and yet they generate most of their revenue in wealthy states like France or Germany or Italy. So on one hand, I think it's good to impose a tax on them. Whether that's 3% or whether there's a threshold, I think that could be negotiated. That's what talking is about. That's what having dialogue is about. Now, although I'm American, I'm very discouraged by President Trump, who, if he's trying to protect American companies, is shooting himself in the foot. I consider a 100% tax on French wine ineffective. It's not going to change French behavior, and stupid.
Okay.
It's like his wall. It's like his wall for trying to stop immigrants. If he taxes French wine 100%, what does that do for all of the other countries in the world that don't make French wine, that also want to tax?
Gotcha. Over there, your opinions. Let me go to Ms. Pybus. Of course, we're not talking just about France. We're also talking about other countries such as Spain and Britain. And so there is a series of discussions going on in the European continent about this. Tell us exactly to the Europeans, what is the nature of the discussion?
I would say that there's two issues. So on the one hand, if we're just looking at the taxation issue and these large companies, that the fact that France has done this, I think it signals to a lot of countries that, you know, we need to take into consideration that 7 of the 10 biggest economic companies in the world are tech companies who don't really need to pay taxes or have very easy ways of avoiding them. If we look at these 4 bigger companies, if we think about Google, their advertising revenue last year was over $136 billion. If you look at Facebook, their advertising revenue last year was $36 billion. And the way in which they accrue this revenue isn't just through the company, but if you look at the internet and look behind every single website that exists out there, you will see trackers of Facebook and Google and Amazon there getting data from the users of these different sites. So the fact that as users, we are providing the revenue for all of these companies, I think it's reasonable for government to want to take some percentage of this money back and bring it back into the country. In terms of Trump, however, I mean, the Republicans haven't typically aligned themselves with the tech industry, so I don't see it as a conspiracy there or from that perspective. But I think for Trump, he has a protectionist agenda, so the fact that these are American companies, he wants to be seen as being strong for America. And I think he's also looking ahead for his future re-election, and in his mind, confrontation is good for election.
I see. If we talk about numbers, we have to convince people with the real numbers. So let's take a look at what the tech giants, who are often referred to as GAFA, in other words, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, are the major players to be affected by the French digital tax. But take a look at what they have earned. A 3% tax will apply to about 30 companies with at least $28 million in sales in France and $831 million worldwide. According to 2018 figures from the European Commission, though, global tech companies, with these companies as the major ones, pay on average a 9.5% tax rate, compared with 23.2% for traditional companies. So there is about 15% difference there. So, Mr. Fain, help us to understand, how do you see these numbers?
Well, the numbers show that there's a problem with regard to fair taxation in the digital age, where it's difficult to identify the location, a territorial location of a transaction. But that doesn't mean that all resolutions are optimal. The issue that we are confronting today with France is, well, there needs to be an even-handed, perhaps enhanced tax on international transactions involving the Internet. But is this the right way to do it, when by and large the protectionist really is in France, because they're protecting their domestic Internet companies who don't satisfy the revenue trigger from competition, because they don't pay the 3% tax. So I think the issue really is, can there be a more appropriate international consensus on how to treat all the international behemoths? And because, and as you well know, in China, Ali Habib, you also have perhaps one of the largest tech companies in the whole world, ranking with Google.
Ms. Pybus, on the other hand, this tax is not just against or supposed to be toward American tech giants. It's toward tech giants of any company from any country in the world, including whether it's France or Chinese or Japanese or South Koreans or German. This is a universal tax that the French authorities put on tech companies all over the world, even though most of the tech giants are coming from the United States. Did I understand that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, if you look at the biggest tech companies in Europe and in North America, there's certainly, as you said, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. But of those 7 largest companies, we also have Tencent and Alibaba. So certainly some of the Chinese companies are put into that category, among other larger economies. But I think for France, when they're looking at this, they're looking at, you know, if Google is working in their country, you know, these companies are there, and like any other, if you're making a profit, then you need to pay a percentage back in tax. That certainly works for the companies that are working in the country. It works for the individuals that work in that country. But then things get very difficult when you have a digital company that is sort of moving between, because there is no border for the digital.
And therefore, Mr. Fain, if I could briefly invite your opinion before I go to Professor Yates, that is this a good and healthy start of discussions, at least, or push for discussions among governments about tax rates toward tech companies all over the world? As we have mentioned, there is almost a 15% tax difference between traditional firms and tech giants.
Yes, it is a healthy discussion, but I want to underscore, although it's true that the tax so-called applies even-handedly to these giant behemoths, if we're really worried about an even playing field for everyone who's engaged in Internet commerce, why is there a threshold at all? Why shouldn't everyone be required to pay the 3% tax? Take, for example, a sales tax. You can have huge grocery chains, and you buy an item and you pay 5% tax. If you go to a very small mom-and-pop store, you still pay a 5% tax. It's even-handed. That's not how the French tax work. And the French know they don't have any giant, you know, that's going to be hit by this particular tax, which is why the thresholds were selected. But let's go back. If it's Internet, then let's tax everyone, big, small, medium alike.
Okay. Professor Yates, do you think that makes sense? Is that the major issue or what is the major issue here? Can we start the discussion?
Well,
will the discussion of this kind lead us to anything?
Well, certainly removing the threshold would test the validity of that argument. I doubt that the U.S. position, at least Donald Trump's position, would change much. And that's because of the man who is right now the United States Trade Representative, the man appointed by Donald Trump, who is really the brain behind the withdrawal from NAFTA, the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the trade war with China, and now a new war with our allies, and that's Robert Lighthizer. And this man is ideologically the mastermind of American trade protectionism. He's got a lot of valid arguments. He's extremely intelligent and competent, and most of all, he's well liked by the senators. He's well liked by the congressmen.
I mean, we do not want to provide a platform for personal attacks unless the analysis of the person itself has a lot to do with the nature of discussion of policy that we are having right now. So can you help us to understand how is that linked to your argument? And what kind of discussion, as I questioned earlier, will policies like this lead all of us to? Professor, please.
Okay, well, let me do this in order 1, 2, and I'll go really fast because I know time's important. If you watch him doing a hearing before the Senate a few months ago concerning the sanctions that were being imposed on China, and that was an open source hearing. This one is closed. You would see senators coming from wine districts in the Napa Valley complaining about Canadian wine. And so I don't think it's coincidental that Donald Trump, who doesn't, of course, drink wine, would have chosen to target wine, because that's building a coalition in Congress to support this trade representative. Now, what happens when you get a trade war? A trade war is like a mud fight. And fairly soon, everyone's got mud on him.
I see.
A 3% tax on GAFA, 100% tax on wine. Fairly soon, you have a disruption in world trade that is knocking 5% off GDP, off world GDP.
Got you. Got you.
I think
got
the
your
consequence.
Point. Yeah, you explained it well. Thank you, sir. Come back to you, Professor Fang, about that. One is, Professor Yates is saying very clearly that you are arguing with double standards. While you are arguing the French side, putting 3% tax on tech giants, all countries involved under this tax. And yet, you are also not arguing when it comes to the U.S. levying 100% wine tax toward French wine rather than 100% tax on the wine produced in the United States. So it's interesting.
Well, I never addressed that.
It's interesting, according to Professor Yates, at least, what you're saying right now, and it's certainly a sign of protectionism when you have 100% tax on a product coming from one country. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I never addressed the retaliatory Taft proposal, which I don't support. So you ascribe to me an opinion that I never voiced. Sometimes you need to threaten retaliation in order to prevent a protectionist element from coming.
Could you help us to understand why you didn't support that?
I don't support it because I think the best approach here is to try to push down trade barriers rather than to increase them. And 100% is wildly disproportionate to a 3% tax. It's not calculated to try to have a tit for tat, but to drop a nuclear bomb in response to throwing a hand grenade. That doesn't make any sense to me.
All right.
But I want to go back to point to there's domestic politics in France, too. It's just not domestic politics in the United States with wine producers. And I have no doubt, even not living in Paris, that these smaller Internet companies figured they're being crushed by the Internet giants. Hey, isn't this a way we can gain some measure of competitive advantage of them by having a 3% tax that they have to pay and not us? Domestic politics is the same everywhere.
All right. Ms. Pybus, here's the difficult question for you after the other two gentlemen spoken already. So here's two issues, I guess, they are addressing. One is the free trade issue. That's one thing. The other is about politics involved in trade. Now, the free trade issue is vis-a-vis protectionism, of course, that people have been talking about. So where does this incident lead us to the discussion about these two parts? Ms. Pybus.
I mean, in terms of what's going on right now, I would be kind of looking at this as the beginning of an agenda that surely Trump is setting out with Europe. Because we don't forget that actually in November there's fear that there's going to be another 25% levy against the auto trade in Germany and France as well. And so, and many people are saying right now that Europe is a new target for trade war with the United States. So on the one hand, if we think about this 100% against the wine in France, what does that do for Trump? I mean, on the one hand, we can look at his base in the U.S. Many of the people that are going to vote for Trump don't drink wine. They don't care about wine, and this is not going to be an issue for them. It's not going to impact on them, even if the price increases. So for him, this is a safe political decision that will, one, demonstrate him as a strong protectionist. Two, will signal to his base that he wants to put America first, whatever this means. And three is trying to situate himself in terms of getting re-election. And for him, confrontation, whether it's with China, now with Europe, even with Canada, because I'm Canadian, this has always worked, well, in his mind is working well, and certainly has helped to secure his political base in the United States. So I think that on the one hand, there's a kind of political agenda that he has with this, which is about himself, as many things are, and then there's a kind of larger global trade war concern that the other two gentlemen have also been talking about and indicating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pybus. But before we go, I do want to have the other two gentlemen, since they are based in Paris and in Washington, to shed some light for us about the genuine nature about what should be the obligations of tech giants around the world. After all, they are the ones that been profiting and also paying much less tax than traditional firms. And after all, they are the ones most active in selling personal data of their users to different parts of the world for profits. So let me have a brief and yet concise answer from both of you, from the business perspective and certainly from the legal perspective. Mr. Fain.
Well, I think they have to pay their fair share. Maybe it means that they have to be more discriminating in gathering information so you can calculate more readily a proportion of their business revenues that you can tie to a particular country. That's how it does with international taxation. If you're taxing a huge company that has business operations in many different countries of the world, yet they have a single profit center, you try to allocate the profits based upon the number of employees, the amount of revenues, their business presence in each of the countries. It's more difficult to do in an internet age because you don't necessarily know the location of where your customer is. But I do think that the goal ought to be to drive down trade barriers. I will note that when Herbert Hoover was president, he signed the Smoot-Hawley tariff that created a protectionist measure that makes Donald Trump look like he's a free trader. Herbert Hoover was crushed in the next presidential election against Mr. Roosevelt. So protectionism isn't always a successful political card in the United States.
We'll see. What about the United States now? Professor Yates, your final words also about the same question. What about a genuine discussion about what should be the obligations of tech giants around the world, or tech companies around the world?
Yeah, so I think that these companies need to operate globally, and generating profit is going to inspire them to continue to innovate, to continue to reach out to consumers. So I don't think we want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And I think some of the world's great economists have been trying to find a way of creating global taxes for things like poverty alleviation, for things like our energy transition.
Okay.
There are public goods, public commons, and perhaps a global flat tax that could go towards these needs would avoid the nationalism inherent in protectionism and in taxing other people's
All right,
goods.
we got 30 seconds left for you, Ms. Piper, since you talked earlier already about it a bit. But before we go, also final words from you, Dr. Piper.
I would say that given the fact that the entire economic engine of these companies is predicated on the selling of our data, of everyone else's data, there needs to be some kind of regulation for these companies. We have no idea how any of that data is being used. We have all of these issues around political advertising that have now crept up all over the world around fake news. There needs to be some accountability, and there absolutely needs to be some way of taxing these companies so that some of the revenue comes back to the people that they're harvesting the data from.
We'll see how the debate would evolve in the days, weeks, and certainly probably years ahead. For now, I want to thank the three of you coming from different perspectives, but certainly sharing your insights with us. Jennifer Pybus, Douglas Yates, last but not least, Bruce Fain. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.